Alright, so I have two phones in my hands here. This one came out last year, and this one came out this year. They look very similar because they are very similar. Technically, the 2026 one is better than the 2025 one, sure, but we're talking only the barest minimum of improvements. So this brings up a big question. Should this year's phone even exist in the first place? A few weeks ago, I made a video going over this phone, which is the Google Pixel 10a. In that video, I asked for your opinions. Would you rather have a yearly phone upgrade include a whole lot of cool new features, but at a substantially higher cost? Or would you prefer a yearly upgrade with minimal new features, but the same price as the previous one? I'll leave a link up here if you want to watch it and check out the comments because there were a lot of cool insights from viewers. But I kind of messed up here because a lot of the replies were people saying there should be a third option. What if there were no upgrade at all each year and phones came out every 2 years instead? So the idea of phone upgrades coming once every 2 years instead of once every year has been discussed on the internet for a long time now. So far though, only a handful of companies have ever actually done it. Right now, the most famous company to do it is Nothing with its mainline series of flagships. The Nothing Phone 1 came out in 2022, and the Nothing Phone 2 came out the following year in 2023. But the Nothing Phone 3 skipped a year and came out in 2025. Earlier this year, Nothing confirmed that it will take a year off from flagships again in 2026, with the Nothing Phone 4 likely coming out in 2027. Of course, this won't stop Nothing from releasing plenty of other phones. They just launched the Nothing Phone 4a and 4a Pro, which is pretty silly considering there's no Nothing Phone 4 yet, but whatever. There will probably be even more Nothing phones before the end of this year. But the thing is that in 2026, there aren't too many other examples of this. Pretty much every major smartphone company out there releases a new iteration of its phones every year like clockwork. But I just saw a slew of comments on my video from people who would be 100% fine with that not happening anymore. So then, why doesn't that happen more often? So let's talk about this. First, let me quickly explain the main reason why phones come out once a year. Then, I want to talk about the pros and cons of releasing phones once every 2 years instead. And finally, we'll need to address the big question. What would need to happen for 2-year upgrades to become the norm? So the core reason phones come out every year is pretty simple, because that's always been how it's done. Here in the United States, during the initial days of smartphones, people would get them through their carrier on a 2-year contract. They'd buy a phone with no upfront cost and then pay it off over the next 2 years, locking them to that carrier for the entire time. This meant that during any given year, roughly 50% of the American smartphone buying population would be up for a contract renewal and would want a new phone. If a company didn't release a new phone each year, they would miss out on that huge swath of people, all looking to get an upgrade. There was also Moore's Law. If you're not familiar, Moore's Law states that computing power roughly doubles every 2 years. Over the past 5 years or so, Moore's Law hasn't been as reliable as it used to be, but back in the early days of smartphones, Moore's Law was definitely in full effect. If you bought a flagship smartphone in 2010 and then bought a similarly priced flagship phone in 2012, it would be a whole new world for you. We're talking jumping from 512 megabytes of RAM to 1 or 2 gigabytes, or going from a single core processor to a quad core processor. Back then, with Moore's Law in full effect, if companies only launched phones once every 2 years, they'd run the risk of having a flagship phone on the shelf that is so far behind the phones that came out that year that they'd look terrible by comparison. There's also the idea that companies want to make as much profit as possible, and numbers must go up. So they do whatever they could to release something new every year. But like I said before, in the past 5 or so years, this cutthroat competition isn't really there. People are holding onto their phones for much longer than they used to, and a smartphone from 2023 or even 2022 is probably going to be not much worse of a phone than the 2026 equivalent. But smartphone companies have always released phones each year. So They have just continued to keep doing that. So what would be the benefit of not doing that? Why has a company like Nothing decided not to bother with the 1-year cycle for its flagship phones and move to 2 years instead? Well, the most obvious pro for this method is that a phone will be significantly different from the one before it. Just looking at the Nothing Phone 3 and the Nothing Phone 2, they are very different phones, with the Phone 3 having some very meaningful upgrades since it had an extra year to cook. Another pro there is that Nothing probably saved a bunch of money since it didn't need to quickly start planning manufacturing and part buying for a new phone while still actively producing the current phone. But the biggest pro of 2-year cycles would be the environment. Longer upgrade cycles would significantly reduce e-waste and encourage users to hold on to their phones for even longer than they already are. So that all sounds great, right? You get a phone that really feels brand new, costs about as much as the previous model, and you hold on to it for longer and help out the environment. These are the main reasons why so many commenters on my other video would want to move to a 2-year upgrade cycle. But the problems with 2-year cycles hold everything back. The biggest roadblock here is mindshare. Companies know that if they don't stay in the news headlines incessantly throughout the year, they will quickly fade away. That's why a company doesn't launch every single product it's going to make in one go. Take Samsung, for example. They'll launch some laptops this month, a budget phone in another month, a brand new flagship over here, some new tablets here, and on until they've got at least one thing coming out every other month or so. Samsung knows that if it stopped doing that, it would severely hurt its profits, because people would be like, hey, I need a new phone, and there's nothing new from Samsung, so I guess I'll go with this other brand instead. Samsung is terrified of that, so it doesn't change. There are also yearly trends like holiday shopping. Have you ever wondered why so much tech comes out all year leading up to October and then not much gets announced at all? That's because companies know that people will have money to burn in November and December, and they want to have everything out and available by then. If they don't, then that's tons of cash people have going to some other company instead. So, very basically, the biggest cons of 2-year upgrades come down to the company being terrified of ceding too much market share to competitors. But if that's the case, then what could ever change that? So, that brings us to the final discussion topic. What would need to happen for 2-year upgrades to become a reality? Well, the way I see it, there are only 2 possible ways this would work. The first is if you, me, and everyone else decided not to buy smartphones for a year. If companies realize that people simply have no interest in buying new phones annually, then they'd stop making them annually. After all, no company wants to make millions of products and then have them sit in a warehouse somewhere collecting dust. Obviously, though, the likelihood of that happening is very, very low. So, the only other way it could happen is if one of the biggest companies just went for broke and started doing it anyway. I know Nothing is doing it, but Nothing is very, very small, so its influence over the wider industry is pretty low. But what if Apple did it? If Apple said, hey, we're not going to release a new iPhone this year, and we're going to move to an every other year cycle. Well, that would be enough. The entire industry would likely breathe a heavy sigh of relief, knowing that they could do the same thing now without worrying about losing a slew of market share. That would be especially true here in the United States because roughly 55% of the population uses iPhones, so the playing field would be a lot less competitive almost overnight. But would this ever actually happen? Would Apple or any other major company ever decide to move to a 2-year cycle and then have the rest of the industry follow suit? I don't know. It doesn't seem very realistic to me. There's just too much money to be made in smartphones, and every company wants to make as much of it as possible. Even if you could get a major tech CEO like Tim Cook to agree that smartphones come out too frequently now, they'd still be beholden to their shareholders. And those shareholders don't care about the overall industry health or the environment or anything like that. They just want to see numbers go up, whatever it takes. So yeah, I don't think we'll ever move to 2-year upgrade cycles. If we do, it won't be anytime soon, and something massive would need to happen for it to be instigated. Hell, even the COVID-19 pandemic couldn't fully stop the annual smartphone launch trend, and if that couldn't do it, then I don't know what will. But yeah, I greatly appreciate everyone being so excited about this idea. If you're one of the people who commented on my Pixel 10a video, thank you. I'd love to hear more about what you think in the comments of this video, so jump down there and speak your mind. Before you head off, don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you want to hear me talk a bit more about the problems with yearly smartphone upgrades, check out this video here, where I go over the boring launch of the Samsung Galaxy S26 series. I'll see you all down in the comments.